Hello, we're back. All right, I'm gonna try it for just a minute or so and see if maybe it just the rebooting of the connection works. So sorry, there's so many funny things that we looked at via pictures, and yeah, we all missed it. Well, I didn't miss it because I was here, but you all missed it. All right, I think we're in better shape now. I can see myself not skipping. Um, I'll wait until I get like the yes, we're good and not skipping before we go back into this. So sorry. All right. Nice. See? Thank you, AJ. All right. So this person. So sorry. Back to what we're talking about. Should I call the cops? My neighbors. They have a newborn baby who cries all the time. Baby disrupts my sleep. Crying is annoying and makes me angry. Yes, make them arrest the baby. Very. That's, babies are babies. Why can't the earth just? Why doesn't the earth just fall down? How can it just float in one space all the time? Science doesn't make sense. Just dogs can't talk, so do they have brains? I know they walk, but it's only because we tell them to. So sometimes it's fine to think stuff, but not to put it out there on the internet. This story won the Pulitzer Prize. Pulitzer Prize, I believe, is what we're looking for. Stop defending his egocentric behavior. They're just, all right. What? Talking about black bears in the North Georgia mountains. And the question is, why are the bears not hypermating? That is not correct. That's what we're looking for. This was a guy working out, and of course, somebody has to troll because we can't just leave each other alone. We can't just scroll past something, and we have to comment on it. And so he's like, "Oh, this guy's proportions are way off. Huge back, tiny bottom." Which please don't comment like that on the internet. He looks like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Norodom. It was Notre Dame is what they're looking for. Unfortunate incident with a pheasant did come off worst, but that was no constellation to me. Consolation again, is what we're looking for. It just nothing starts with O. And here's another one. This is you're just setting up for people. Nothing starts with O and ends with O. Onion. That is not correct. It's one cheap movie ticket. Manatee. Oh, I went to go see a manatee today. Matinee is what we're looking for there. You might want to check your spelling next time. You actually wrote lives instead of lifes. So you're trying to correct somebody else incorrectly. Lives is the correct spelling. It is not lifes. Here we go. Advertising a metal double teeth barber comb. And then the response comes in. This looks like an Amazon review. Not metal at all. Definitely not metal. Things made of aluminum, which is a metal. Oh boy. Ate a whole bag of Cool Ranch one time and got food poisoning. And someone said, check the inspiration date. Couple of things with this. It's expiration date, as we all know, but also it's the eating the whole bag of Cool Ranch Doritos that's the problem here, not so much whether they were expired or not. And dude is mild away from understanding your point. Forward, it's worth. I agree with you wholeheartedly. For what it's worth. Guess who just found out the difference between wax paper and parchment paper the hard way? Hey, Megan, you're actually good that you came late because the first 10 minutes was very skippy with internet issues. So no need to watch back, but we're good now. Somebody found out the difference between wax paper and parchment paper. One you can use in the oven safely, and the other you can use in the oven if the thing you're trying to make happens to be fire. That's actually funny. Sun used to be orange all the time when I was younger. Now it's suddenly changed. This is again, sun changed because chemicals. It was yellow. Now it's white because of chemicals. No. But this one says each country has its own separate sun. That is absolutely not the case. And the last person is just throw a slip cover on it and woo la. I don't know quite what to say to that, but it's wrong. Voila. All right. Let's stop sharing those. And we are going to get back into Romans. Hope you've appreciated our series in Romans. We are not even close to being through yet. So if you're not appreciating it, I am very sorry because we have a lot left to go. So we're in Romans 5 now. and we will show you Romans 5, where we are. So I want you to trust me, but it's also, I can put it right up here in front of you. So this is the deal. All right. So we're in Romans 5, verse 12. We're going 12 to 21 over the next couple of weeks. And this is one of the most difficult passages in Romans. It's not so much that it's hard to comprehend when we read through it. It's just difficult to get your mind around the logic and the fairness of what Paul is writing here. This is one of these passages where if you've ever struggled to believe, perhaps we need to hear God say, hey, you willing to accept my word just because it's my word and comes with my authority? Or do you feel like you need to understand and agree with it before you'll accept it? And I'm not saying just blindly follow stuff that we don't understand, but if Jesus came in the midst of our questions and said, I'm not going to explain, are you willing to trust me to doubt your doubts? You're like, well, that sounds weird. Well, that's exactly what he said to Peter in John chapter 6. Peter had some unanswered questions, and there were a bunch of followers of Jesus who had problems with what he was teaching, and they stopped following him. Peter had some of the same objections as everybody else that was leaving. So he's like, it kind of has this conversation with Jesus. We're going to talk about it a little bit more on Sunday, but he's like, I sympathize with the people that are leaving. I don't understand. And Jesus doesn't explain. He just says, are you going to leave too? And Peter says, where would I go? Have you ever felt that way? Like, so the evidence for Jesus being the Son of God, undeniable to me. Evidence for his resurrection, solid. So where else would I go? Where else could I go? Some definitions of faith, because we're still talking about faith. Faith is when the unexplainable meets the undeniable. Faith is accepting what you cannot understand based on what you can understand. I still think maybe our first year or two in heaven might be like a big classroom with Jesus answering questions, and keep that in mind as we go through some of these things. This passage is going to address a few questions that are asked a lot. What is original sin, and how is it fair? And you're like, original sin, I've heard that term, but I'm not really sure what it is. Is that like a sin that nobody else has ever done before? Like today, I stole a Hershey bar and a Diet Coke while thinking an unkind thought about my frenemy and coveting his sweet ride all at the same time. Like no one's ever done that exact combination. So that's an original sin. Now, what is original sin? We'll talk about it in just a minute. Second, what about babies and mentally challenged? What happens to them when they die? And what about people who have never heard the gospel? Paul teaches some concepts here that touch on all these things in these 10 final verses of Romans 5. So if you remember, first 11 verses of Romans 5 that we covered the last 2 weeks, Paul showed us how the gospel reshapes our view of trials and suffering. So he shifted from argumentation for the gospel up till then to celebration of the gospel. And now he's shifting back to a little bit more argumentation and apologetics. This might be one of the densest doctrinal sections in Romans. John Stott says it's like a carefully constructed musical composition where every note is chosen carefully and just breezing through it. You have no idea all the complexity that's there. John Stott says that, really smart pastor and writer. But it's important not to separate this, he says, from the felt need stuff Paul was just talking about. In other words, how to have joy and hope in the midst of trials. Sometimes we tend to think that there's two kinds of Bible teaching: the relevant practical stuff for normal people, and then the deep doctrinal stuff for seminary nerds. That's not how Paul saw it. He saw that the practical is connected to the deep. The way to deal with issues in your life is to go deeper in who you are in Christ, right? Deeper and wider is what we want our relationship and our knowledge of Jesus to be. The first word in this paragraph, so this is the section that we're in, starting with Romans 5, verse 12, it says, therefore. And when he uses therefore, he's showing us that what he's about to say connects with what he just said about having joy in suffering. So these are not just words for seminary students. These truths that we're going to read and go over in the next couple of weeks are how all of us can face life with hope and balance and joy, how we can live free from bitterness and regret. So here we go. He writes, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, talking about Adam, and death through sin, so death spread to all men or all people because all sinned. And then we skip verse 13 for now. And death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin or whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one to come. If you remember in chapter 4, Paul used the story of Abraham to show how Abraham's life illustrates being justified by faith. And here in chapter 5, he's going to go back even farther, all the way back to Adam, the first man, to show how Adam's story sets up the gospel. He's going to show that all of history can be told as the story of two Adams. Those of you sci-fi fans will know that Star Wars has been called the tale of two Skywalkers. The first Skywalker, Anakin, gave into the temptation to embrace the dark side. And in so doing, he brought death, destruction, and chaos into the whole galaxy. The second Skywalker, Luke, faced the same temptation, but he was faithful and obedient to the Jedi way. Good boy, he was. And because of that, he was able to reverse the curse that came from the disobedience of the first Skywalker and even able to redeem, in a sense, the first Skywalker. George Lucas, the writer, said that the central theme of episodes 4 through 6, which I won't go over how the episodes are lined out, was the redemption of Anakin, the first Skywalker, by Luke II. Similarly, you could say that the entire storyline of the Bible is about the redemption of the first Adam by the second Adam, Jesus Christ. If I didn't lose you with the skipping in the beginning of this episode, I may have lost you with the sci-fi Star Wars reference. But this is what's happening in Romans chapter 5, 12 to 21. Here's a basic idea. Adam, the first human being created, chose to defy God's authority and reject his clear command to avoid the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you know the story of Genesis, you know the story of Adam and Eve, then you're aware of this. But Paul's saying because of that choice, death descended on all people. Even though we weren't physically present with Adam, God regards Adam's choice to be ours. That's called the doctrine of original sin. And notice how verse 12 ends. Therefore, as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, in this way, death spread to everyone. In other words, we all sinned through him in him. Like, well, that wasn't fair. Like, I wasn't consulted. Like, there was no committee. I didn't get a vote. How can I be held responsible for something that I had no part in? And this is where many have struggled over the years. This is where the great theologian C.S. Lewis did too, for what it's worth. I mean, think about it. The effects of this choice by Adam were not insignificant. Because of this choice, death came on all of us. It means every disease, every natural disaster, every painful struggle with cancer, every child born with a birth defect, every divorce, every war, every case of abuse, even hell itself goes back to this choice. We weren't there for that. One little boy, when a Sunday school teacher first taught this, was like, man, when I get to heaven, I'm going to kick Adam's tail. So how is this fair? Well, in calling Adam our representative, God's saying he knew that what Adam chose is what each of us would have chosen had we been given the choice. Keep in mind, God was not some passive observer. He is the infinitely wise creator. He understands literally everything about us. And he knew that how Adam acted would be how each of us would react in that situation. So we can't say, no, if I had been there in the Garden of Eden, I would have done the right thing. Because that's saying we know more than God. God knows all, and he's infinitely just. He knew that given the same temptation, we would have done the same thing Adam did. Think about it. We can't even keep Oreos in our house without being tempted. And you think you could have resisted the temptation to eat from a tree that promised godlike power and knowledge? You're like, well, I still didn't make the choice, so it doesn't seem fair to be held accountable for something I didn't choose. Okay, but if you ratified that choice at some point in your life? Hasn't there been a point in your life where you adopted Adam's line of thinking? Like, I know better than God. I'd rather do what I want to do than what God wants me to do. How many times in our life have we known what the right thing to do was and we did the opposite? There's a story that St. Augustine told 1,500 years ago. Augustine, one of my favorite guys to talk about, but he wasn't raised as a Christian. He ran with a pretty sketchy crowd as a teen. They had some cool name in Latin that's similar to the Destructors. And one night they had just finished playing sports in the streets of their neighborhood. They're walking home and they noticed a tree with a bunch of pears on it. It was on somebody else's property. And here's the thing, Augustine said later, the pears didn't even look that good. And none of us were hungry. He said, but we went over and we stole a bunch of them anyway. We ended up tasting a few and then just dumping them out over the fence for the hogs. He said, but we loved doing it because it was forbidden. And Augustine said, it's always haunted me why I stole those pears. And he said this, I delighted in doing the wrong. He said, such was my heart, O God, such was my heart, which thou didst pity, even in that bottomless pit. Behold, now let my heart confess to thee what it was seeking there when I was being gratuitously wanton, having no inducement to evil, but the evil itself. He's like, why did I do that? He said, it was foul, and I loved it. I loved my own undoing. I loved my error, not that for which I erred, but the error itself. He said, a depraved soul falling away from security in thee to destruction in itself, seeking nothing from the shameful deed, but shame itself. And I think for all of us, we can look back and see points in time where we chose the wrong just because it was wrong, because we had inward delight or an attraction to it. We've all nursed a secret resentment of God and his authority. So back to Paul, even though we weren't physically present with Adam when he sinned, we've all ratified his choice. And I think that those things are implied in that phrase at the end of verse 12, because all have sinned. That means we all sinned in Adam because God regarded him as our representative. And we've ratified, solidified his choice since then. And the result of that is that Paul says death spread to all people, which means physical death and spiritual death. So I think even if you're still struggling with the logic behind why original sin works like it does, we have to at least concede the presence of its effects. G.K. Chesterton said, original sin is the only doctrine that's empirically verifiable. Why does he say that? Because everybody dies. I'll say original sin, Adam and Eve, death comes into the world. Despite all our technology, the death rate in the human race holds steady at 1 to 1. Everybody dies. Death and disease affect everyone. Nice people, cruel people, smart people, ignorant people, rich people, poor people, innocent infants, as much as adults. And spiritual death means that we're all born in a posture of rebellion towards God, each with a clenched fist toward the heavens, assuming our way is better and our desires are most important. Every parent knows this, right? Like kids come out of the womb like those seagulls from Finding Nemo. They're like, mine, 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 mine. Seriously, have you ever seen a 2-year-old displaying gentleness and selflessness? Not very often do you hear stories of an 18-month-old that ever said, hey, mom and dad, you look like you've had a tough day. Why don't you just put me in my room and go take some you time? Like that doesn't happen. Kids are born thinking about themselves. We've never had to send any of the Brookridge kids to sin camp. They never have to take selfishness seminars. They come by those things instinctively. They inherited those things from you, the parents, right? The acclaimed child psychologist Burton White wrote a lot about early childhood development. He said from 15 to 16 months on, as the child's self-awareness becomes more substantial, something in his nature we don't fully understand will lead him to deliberately try each of these forbidden activities, specifically to see what will be allowed and what won't. In other words, he will begin systematically to challenge the authority of the adults he lives with. Resistance to simple requests becomes very common at this time. I think we call it the terrible twos. And if there's more than one child around, this can be a low point in the parenting experience. A low point, that's what you call it when you feel like clawing your eyes out, right? Something in his nature which we don't fully understand. Well, we understand it because God revealed it to us in the scriptures. Something inside him is that spirit of Adam who wants to do things his way. So even if you don't understand the logic of original sin, you can at least see the effects of it. How else do you explain the pervasive wickedness of the human race, right? Why do we as a race have such trouble doing what's right, even when we know it's wrong or bad for us? Why do riches almost always lead to selfishness? Why does power almost always lead to corruption? Why are we attracted to wrong things so much? There's an alternate theory as to where selfishness comes from. It's posed by atheistic evolution, basically, that selfishness is bred into us through the principle of the survival of the fittest. Like that selfishness helped our species or our family line survive in a harsh and competitive environment. So our species, our family line is here because we figured out a way to claw and crawl our way to the top, and that didn't happen by being kind and selfless. So according to this theory, there's no such thing as wrong, because wrong implies a referee who has established some sort of rules. There's only useful or harmful for the propagation of the species. In recent years, even evolutionists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, they've realized the moral bankruptcy of that worldview. And they've said, well, now that we're in an advanced state, we see that kindness and love can actually help humans survive in community. So we should choose that. They're not saying that love is inherently good. They're just saying that now it appears to be useful for our species, whereas before, cruelty and dominance were useful. So the internal logic of this theory: selfishness, exploitation are not wrong or evil per se, because there's no wrong or evil. They're simply not useful. If you're an agnostic, you have to consider this, because this is a really big deal, especially when it comes to something like justice. Martin Luther King Jr. said the reason segregation laws in America were unjust was because they conflicted with the higher laws of God. There was some racist at the time who would have said, well, the old system is more useful. But MLK said, useful or not, it's wrong, because we're all made in the image of our Creator. If we were just accidental biology and chemistry, you can't say that. You can only argue in terms of usefulness, not right or wrong. Because in order for something to be wrong, there has to be some higher standard to appeal to. So there's two basic options. There's the atheistic option, which says there's no such thing as good and evil, which makes justice impossible. The other basic option is the Christian one, which says that every single person alive is horribly bent toward evil. We need Jesus. We need a savior. And you're like, well, thanks, Russ. With those are my two options. I have to say, it's very depressing so far. There is a lot of bad news when we're talking about original sin. But in verse 13, which we're going to cover next week, Paul says this whole idea of being represented by somebody is actually great news, because it set up the way of our salvation. Because if the whole world was put under sin by one man, what if salvation could come to everyone by one man also? And that's exactly where Paul turns next. And by next, I mean next week. Thank you for hanging with us. Sorry for the skipping. I don't know what happened. Maybe I should have clicked in and out of this program quicker, but I appreciate you sticking with me. I appreciate our community, and look forward to Sunday, and have a fantastic week.